This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsuhone, and today I'm continuing my limited review for Strixhaven. I've looked at all the mono-colored white, blue, and black cards so far, and today we're looking at red. As the week goes on, I'll be covering all of the other cards in the set before concluding the review with an archetype guide. Keep in mind that in this review, I'm only talking about the limited formats, that's draft and sealed. I'm not talking about other formats like standard or commander. I conclude my evaluation of each of these cards with a letter grade that sort of sums up my thoughts about the card. If you're new to my set reviews, there's an explanation of what each grade means in the description. Another notable thing about this set is that it has the Mystical Archive cards. These are a special set of reprints, and one card from the archive appears in every Strixhaven pack, so I'll also be reviewing all of those cards in the last part of each of these videos. Alright, let's look at our first red card. First we have Academic Dispute, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature blocks this turn if able. You may have it gain reach until end of turn. And it has Learn, which is a new mechanic in this set that either lets you get a lesson, a certain kind of spell subtype that we'll see later in this video, lets you get one of those from your sideboard, or it lets you rummage. In other words, discard a card and draw a card. So this is a weird card. It kind of has multiple modes. One of them is that you use it to force your opponent's creature to block in a situation where that creature dies and yours survives. The other is that you can use it defensively to get reach on one of your guys to block a flyer. Then there's the modality of Learn, which will either let you rummage or grab a lesson from your sideboard. Basically, it gives you a bunch of small options. Overall, I think this does come out as a solid playable. It doesn't hurt that it's a cheap spell in a format that cares a lot about you playing spells, either. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Ardent Dust Speaker, which for 4 generic and a red is a 3/4 Minotaur Shaman at uncommon, and when it attacks, you can put an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. If you do, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. So this helps trigger all the cards in red-white that like it when things leave your graveyard, and it will effectively draw you cards at the same time. That's pretty powerful, so of course they had to make the creature rather inefficient as a 5 mana 3/4. Even with that limitation though, this is going to be quite good. 3/4 is enough size to attack on lots of boards, and as long as the best your opponent can do is trade with this, you're going to be in business because the cards you get from the effect will help you come out ahead from that trade. In some situations, even if the Dust Speaker is going to die without killing anything, attacking will still be worth it for the effect. You can also get serious value by giving it evasion or stats boosts that make things harder on your opponent. If this gets to use that ability more than once, chances are you just win. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Blood Age General, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Spirit Warrior at common, and you can tap it, and attacking spirits get +1/+0 until end of turn. This is a bear with some nice upside for the red-white deck especially, which will have plenty of spirits. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Conspiracy Theorist, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Human Shaman at rare. When it attacks, you can pay 1 generic and discard a card, and if you do, draw a card, and whenever you discard 1 or more non-land cards, you may exile one of them from your graveyard. If you do, you may cast it this turn. This is another pretty nice bear. It lets you rummage when you attack, which would already be a card you usually play, but what really makes it nice is the fact that you can exile the card you discard and cast it during your turn. It is unfortunate it doesn't work with lands, but because you make the choice on what to discard, you can make sure to discard something cheap that you can play, at which point you're no longer rummaging, you're just netting cards. Now, sometimes in the early game, you'll find yourself unable to pay the mana and cast the thing you discard, and in the late game, you might find that attacking with the Theorist is unwise because he's so small, but he still has utility all game long since he helps you rummage. I think I'll be first picking this guy regularly, giving him a B. Next up, it's Crackle with Power, which has 3 different X symbols in its mana cost and 2 red mana symbols. It's a mythic rare sorcery, and it says Crackle with Power deals 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. So for 5 mana, this does 3 damage to something as a sorcery, which isn't so good. For 8 mana though, it does 10 damage to 2 things, and keep in mind you can hit your opponent with this. Now, in most formats, I would be skeptical about being able to make this work, but Blue-Red has such a strong ramp theme with treasure all over the place that I think this will actually be castable at 8 mana often enough to be a really great card, and at least it has the fail case of still killing something or doing 3 to the opponent if you don't get to 8. I mean, if you are casting it for 8 all the time, obviously it's a bomb, but we do have to temper our expectations some. Even in a blue-red ramp deck, getting to 8 won't just be a simple thing. It will happen often enough for this card to be an easy first pick though. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Draconic Intervention, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, you exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. And it deals X damage to each non-dragon creature, where X is the exiled card's mana value. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. Exile Draconic Intervention. This is quite the powerful effect. You can use it to wipe the whole board sometimes, or even better, exile something that does enough damage to decimate your opponent's board, but doesn't hurt yours quite as much. Thing is, you do need to have a spell of the right cost in your graveyard to really make it work, and that just won't line up sometimes. So I think that holds it back some, at least as far as board sweepers go. Still seems like a really good card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Dragon's Approach, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery, and it deals 3 damage to each opponent. You may exile Dragon's Approach, and 4 cards name Dragon's Approach from your graveyard. If you do, search your library for a dragon creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. A deck can have any number of cards named Dragon's Approach. This is a neat design, but not really one that will work out in Limited. Even if you get like 6 of these in your draft, the chances you have the necessary ones in your graveyard at some point still aren't great, and that's without even mentioning that you also need a dragon for this effect to do anything additionally. Basically, this is just a Lava Axe type effect, and those normally don't play great in Limited, since they cost you a card and don't impact the board. This is an F. Next up, it's Ifrit Flame Painter, which for 3 generic and a red is a 1/4 Ifrit Shaman at rare. It's got double strike, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. So if this gets through for damage, it's going to get pretty silly. Because it has double strike, you'll get to cast 2 instants or sorceries for free if you have them in your graveyard. If you can do that even once, that's going to win most games. Now, given that it's just a 1/4, getting through with it won't be a cakewalk, but it's worth remembering that this thing has such a scary combat damage trigger that your opponent will have to be really careful, and they will leave back blockers they just wouldn't have before. Using a removal spell to get a blocker out of the way and then attacking with the Flame Painter and casting that spell for free is going to happen sometimes, and that's going to feel amazing. Because it has to alter the way your opponent plays the game, it'll even have impacts even in games where it doesn't get to do its super powerful effect. I think it's a B+. Next up, it's Enthusiastic Study, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant, and target creature gets +3/+1 against trample until end of turn, and it has Learn. So, after having run amok, a card like Enthusiastic Study seems pretty underwhelming. It is brute strength with Learn upside, and that seems pretty alright as far as tricks go. I don't love the only +1 boost to toughness, as that drastically decreases the number of situations where it'll help your creature win combat, but at least it also adds trample, which can be pretty big in some situations. Even with the Learn upside, I'm not overly enthusiastic about this trick. 3 mana for this boost just doesn't feel great to me. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Explosive Welcome, which for 7 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it deals 5 damage to any target and 3 damage to any other target, and you add 3 red mana. 8 mana is a whole lot, but the blue-red deck looks capable of producing that kind of mana. This will often get you a 2-for-1, which is nice, but the thing I wonder is how often the mana it gives you back will be usable. If you just spent a bunch of mana to cast this, it was probably the last card in your hand, so where's that mana going? Probably nowhere most of the time. This has some serious explosive potential in the later part of the game, but because it probably only fits in blue-red or maybe a blue-green deck that's splashing it, it does have limitations, and even in those decks it won't always work out, but I want to start it at a C. Next up, it's Fervent Mastery, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery. You can pay 2 generic and 2 red rather than pay its mana cost, and if you pay that alternate cost, an opponent discards any number of cards, then draws that many cards. Then it says search your library for up to 3 cards, put them into your hand, shuffle, and discard 3 cards at random. So even with the red-white deck liking stuff in the graveyard, this seems pretty bad. 5 to search up 3 cards and then discard 3 randomly is pretty bad and limited. You spin your wheels and search up some stuff, and then you don't even know if you're going to get to keep what you searched up. Now, if you can cast this for 4, that's obviously better, and sometimes your opponent won't actually be able to do the benefit you offer them there. So I guess that's a thing, but it still doesn't seem good to me at all. It's a bad, expensive tutor that just won't work out more often than it will. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's First Day of Class, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it and it gains haste until end of turn, and it has Learn. So if you're only able to make one creature benefit from this, it won't feel all that good, even if you have a lesson to grab. After all, most of the lessons are kind of mediocre, but they're worthwhile because you get them for free when you learn with a card like First Day of Class. So you kind of need your card with Learn to do something worth close to a card, and if you're just getting one counter and giving one thing haste, I'm not sure you're doing it. Keep in mind you can also choose to rummage instead of getting a lesson, and sometimes that will just be better. Now, where this does start to get interesting is when you play multiple creatures in a turn, which won't necessarily be easy if you're just casting regular old creature spells, but if you have a way to make multiple creature tokens in a turn, this will start to feel pretty good. All in all, I'm not super high on this to start just because I don't think it will be all that easy to make it work consistently, but I could see myself being wrong here. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Fuming Effigy, which is 3 generic and a red for a 4/3 spirit at common, and whenever one or more cards leaves your graveyard, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So this is mostly here for the red-white deck, which makes cards leave the graveyard pretty often. This is likely to do a few damage in that deck, in addition to having reasonable stats to start with, giving it a C. Next up, it's Grinning Ignis, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 uncommon elemental, and you can pay 1 red mana and return it to your hand and add 2 colorless mana and 1 red mana, activate only as a sorcery. This is an interesting reprint, a card we haven't seen in a while. Basically, the Ignis gives you something of a ritual effect. It gives you a short-term mana boost, but when you actually look at the mana you spend, which is 3 to play it and 1 to use the ability, you're actually coming out behind mana-wise. Still, the blue-red deck in this format looks interested in getting a bunch of mana in single turns for big crazy spells, so it probably has a home there, giving it a C. Next, it's Hall Monitor, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Lizard Shaman at uncommon. It's got haste, and you can pay 1 generic and a red and tap it, and target creature can't block this turn. Cheap cards that make something unable to block have a pretty good track record in Limited. Making just one thing unable to block is often enough to make your whole board capable of attacking, and this thing is a Raging Goblin on turn 1, which means it will get in for some damage early, and then in the later part of the game really make blocking a challenge for your opponent. This seems like a great card for aggro decks. I'm giving it a B-. Next, it's Heated Debate, which for 2 generic and a red is a common instant. It can't be countered, and it deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. This is most likely red's best common. 3 mana for 4 damage at instant speed is always great in Limited, and this also can't be countered, which actually matters in this set more often than I think it does in most, as blue seems to have several playable counterspells. This is a B. Next up, it's Igneous Inspiration, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It deals 3 damage to any target, and it has Learn. This will frequently feel like 3 mana, kill something, draw a card, and that's going to be pretty great. You can also go after your opponent, which is nice. This is another premium red removal spell. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Illuminate History, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a rare sorcery lesson, and you can discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards. Then, if there are 7 or more cards in your graveyard, you get a 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. This seems like a lesson that may just be okay enough to main deck in this format if you don't get any Learn, since Lorehold especially is so into the graveyard. Paying 4 to rummage a bit and make a 3/2 isn't really that bad, and if you can do that consistently, this is certainly a playable card in your main deck. If you do have several cards with Learn, you probably do want to leave it in your sideboard, as it essentially makes all of those cards more flexible and gives you more windows where you can grab a card in an ideal situation, because top decking this with an empty hand, for example, won't feel so good. It's probably a C in your deck and a B out of your lesson board. Next up, it's Illustrious Historian, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 human shaman at common. You can pay 5 generic and exile it from your graveyard to make a tap 3/2 red and white spirit creature token. Nothing this card does is efficient, but that's kind of not the point. It's a card you can play early on curve and then trade with something, and in the later game you get a 3/2 out of your graveyard. It'll feel a little bit like Kicker, where sometimes you have cards that don't feel especially efficient no matter how you cast them, but the fact that they have the flexibility to do both is good. Maybe Embalm is actually a better comparison because this involves the graveyard. And yeah, like I said, it's not efficient, but it will be a 2-for-1 sometimes, even if it is kind of expensive. Gives you a nice late game thing to do with your mana when you have this creature in your graveyard. I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Mascot Interception, which for 3 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It costs 3 less to cast if it targets a creature token, and you gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it. It gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. So there are a reasonable number of tokens in this format. That's a product of a set with an instant and sorcery theme. So being able to use this to steal one for only a single mana is some actual real upside. Note, by the way, if you need to do 2 more damage with one of your own creatures, you can use this on your own guy too, and if it's your token, it also costs 1 red. Still, these threaten effects tend to be highly situational, and they're not especially good in most formats. Being cheap a reasonable chunk of the time does overcome some of that, but I have a hard time believing in threatens until I see them work out. They just don't have a good track record at all. I'm giving this a D+. Next, it's Pigment Storm, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a common sorcery that deals 5 damage to target creature. Excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. This effect at sorcery speed is really clunky. If you have to use this to kill a smaller creature, it feels really miserable because of the tempo hit. This does try to make up for that a little by having the damage trample, and that is some nice additional upside, but I still think this falls well short of being premium removal. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Pillar Drop Warden, which for 3 generic and a red is a 1/5 Spirit Dwarf at common. It's got reach. You can pay 2 colorless and tap it and sacrifice it to return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. You can only do it as a sorcery. This has reasonable defensive stats and the ability to bring an instant or sorcery back to your hand, giving it utility pretty much all game long. That seems like a solid common to me, giving it a C. Next up, it's Retriever Phoenix, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/2 Phoenix at rare. It's got flying and haste, so when it enters the battlefield, you learn. And as long as it's in your graveyard, if you would learn, you may instead return the Phoenix to the battlefield. This is a pretty cool payoff for learning. A 4-mana 2/2 with flying and haste that learns already would have been a pretty good card, since it will feel like it draws you a card a significant chunk of the time. But then anytime you learn when it's in your graveyard, you can consider getting it back. Now, you won't always want to do that. The Phoenix isn't exactly large, and sometimes getting a lesson from your sideboard or even rummaging might make more sense, but it is nice that this gives you the option. I think you can first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Start from Scratch, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon lesson sorcery, and it says choose one. Start from Scratch deals 1 damage to any target, or destroy target artifact. This is another lesson I'm reasonably excited about. There's just something about being able to grab these cards with narrow but useful effects out of your sideboard at the ideal time. Your opponent won't always have an artifact in this format. There really aren't very many of them, and they won't always have an X1 to kill or be at 1 life. But if any of those things are true, grabbing Start from Scratch when you learn will feel pretty awesome. I think this is a D+ in your deck and a C+ in your sideboard. Next up, it's Storm Kiln Artist, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/2 Dwarf Shaman at uncommon. It gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control, and it has a Magecraft ability that creates a treasure token. This looks pretty nice. I like that it has a design that synergizes with itself. Even if you have no other artifacts, which is kind of likely, he gets a power boost from the treasures that he makes you. If you can get this to a 4/2, you'll feel like you're really in business. And the fact he makes treasure means he gives red some nice fixing and ramp, which it is interested in this format. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Sudden Breakthrough, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it gives a creature +2/+0 and gives it first strike, and it makes a treasure token. This is a decent trick. It gives a boost large enough for your creature to win combat most of the time, and it gives you a treasure for some fixing and ramping. But you'll probably cut it a lot. After all, it is still a trick, and that means it's risky and highly situational, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Tome Shredder, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 wolf at common. It's got haste, and you can tap it and exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to put a +1/+1 counter on it. This guy can get pretty big on his diet of instants and sorceries, and he'll work especially well in red-white, because that deck can load the graveyard reasonably well, and it also likes it when cards leave the graveyard in any way, and Tome Shredder obviously does that. Now, this does require some significant setup, and it's a pretty inefficient creature if you don't get there, but the fact that it has haste means you can make it a 3/3 right away, putting it out of range of some removal. Sometimes you also just want to attack with it if your opponent's low enough on life. Basically, though, it gets bigger for no mana investment and has synergy within the red-white archetype. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Twin Scroll Shaman, which for 2 generic and a red is a 1/2 Dwarf Shaman at common, and it's got Double Strike. Double Strike 1/2s aren't too bad, and makes this a good place to put counters or otherwise enhance it. That said, that doesn't seem to be a huge focus for red, so I'm not sure how well this will play out overall. It seems decent enough. I'm giving it a C. So Twin Scroll Shaman was our last regular red card that's going to be in draft boosters. We're going to move now to the Mystical Archive. Every pack in this format has a Mystical Archive card. That means there'll be 24 of them in every draft pod. In other words, you'll see these cards, but they're not going to be everywhere either. In other words, you'll see these cards, but they aren't going to be all over the place either. Alright, let's look at the first red Mystical Archive card, which is Chaos Warp. For 2 generic and a red, it's a mythic rare instant, and it says the owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. This is an interesting card to look at for limited. It is random, and sometimes that's a real liability. That said, it isn't the worst answer ever for super powerful cards, and it can hit any permanent type. When you play this on an opponent's permanent, the chances are actually reasonably good that they either hit a land or non-permanent card, and when you do that, it'll feel like a B. But there will also be times where you just upgrade your opponent's permanent, and that won't feel so good. You can also use it on your own stuff in response to removal and things like that, but chances are pretty good you don't get what you want out of this a decent chunk of the time. Overall, I think this card is really inconsistent, but it does have a pretty high ceiling when it really works out. I'm going to give it a C+. Next up, it's Claim the Firstborn, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon sorcery. And it says gain control of target creature with mana value 3 or less until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until end of turn. So this does really efficiently steal creatures, even if it can only go after small ones. This type of effect can be kind of okay in an aggro deck, but I do think you need some sacrifice outlets to really abuse it, because if you have those, you not only get a blocker out of the way for a turn, you kill it forever. Outside of those situations, you just don't want to play this. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Faithless Looting, which for 1 red mana is a rare sorcery, and it says draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards, and it has flashback for 2 generic and a red, which means you can cast it from the graveyard for its flashback cost and then exile it. So this is a pretty nice draw spell. Sure, you don't net any cards, but 1 mana to loot twice is actually quite a good deal. The flashback effect isn't exactly efficient, but like all flashback cards, it does mean you have something to do with your mana late. This gets even better in a deck that wants cards in the graveyard, and even better in a set with Magecraft. Now, it still doesn't do anything to impact the board, but I think there's enough going on for Faithless Looting to be a pretty nice card for all red decks. I'm giving it a C+. Grape Shot, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare sorcery that deals 1 damage to any target, and it has Storm, which means when you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn, and you choose new targets for the copies. Keep in mind that does mean your opponent's spells, so if they cast something on your turn, they may end up helping you get your Storm count up. So this Storm card is cheap enough that I think it'll be pretty good and limited. Getting this to a Storm count of 2 is enough for it to be quite good, because it can kill an X3 or divide the damage in some way to get a 2 for 1. There will be times where you just can't get your Storm going, but even a Storm count of 1 is a reasonably efficient card, and that means the fail case here isn't the worst thing ever. Even doing 1 damage for 2, I mean, obviously that's not great, but when that's the bottom of this card, the worst it's ever going to be, that's not so bad. You shouldn't really expect to go off and win the game with Grape Shot like you can in Cube or the Eternal formats, but I think it works out well enough to be something I first pick pretty often. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Increasing Vengeance, which for 2 red mana is a mythic rare instant, and it says copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, copy that spell twice instead. You may choose new targets for the copies, and it has flashback for 3 generic and 2 red. This is an intriguing card to have in this set with all the spells all over the place, not to mention the payoffs for casting spells as well as playing them. Still, fork effects like this are notoriously hard to make worthwhile and limited, and even having a more powerful flashback doesn't fill me with a whole lot of hope. Having the mana around to copy one of your spells, especially 5 additional mana, isn't very close to a guarantee, and it's not even that much of a guarantee that you'll have the mana to copy a spell if you're just casting this the regular way. I'm not saying this is terrible, but it will be wildly inconsistent. Sometimes it'll copy something incredible. Other times you won't have anything to use it on because you just don't have the mana. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Infuriate, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gets +3/+2 until end of turn. This is a nice trick and a cheap card in a set with lots of spell triggers. It is probably the best red trick in this format, but it's still a trick, so I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Lightning Bolt, which for 1 red mana is a rare instant, and it deals 3 damage to any target. This is Magic's best burn spell ever, so obviously it's really good and limited. Kills lots of stuff really efficiently. You're going to get a big tempo boost out of it, and it can even go for the dome. This is a B+. Next up, it's Mythics' Mastery, which for 3 generic and a red is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says exile target card that's an instant or sorcery from your graveyard. For each card exiled this way, copy it, and you may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. Exile Mythics' Mastery. Then it has Overload for 5 generic and 3 red, and that means that you get to do this with all the instants and sorceries in your graveyard. So if you just cast this the regular way, you get to play a spell from your graveyard for free. That will feel especially good with draw spells or removal, and it will also give you 2 cards to help trigger Magecraft and things like that. If you can overload this, it probably just wins you the game, and as I've been saying throughout this video, ramp is a real thing in red this time around, so doing so isn't entirely crazy. This will sometimes be a dead or underwhelming card, but I think Overload will be doable enough that I want to take this with a relatively high pick, giving it a B. Next up, it's Shock, which is 1 red mana for an uncommon instant, and it deals 2 damage to any target. This is always premium removal. 2 damage can take down a huge chunk of creatures in most formats, including several creatures with higher mana values than this one, and it of course comes with the upside of being able to use on the opponent. This is something you'll first pick in weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Stone Rain, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare sorcery, and it says destroy target land. This kind of effect is basically never good in Limited. Land destruction can work in Constructed sometimes because running a critical mass of cards that blow up lands is possible, and that's not true here. This is an F. Next up, it's Thrill of Possibility, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant, and it says as an additional cost to cast it, discard a card, draw 2 cards. Like all draw spells, Thrill of Possibility gets a bit of an upgrade in this format as a result of Magecraft being a big feature, and that's good news because it's a solid card anyway. Pitching a land to draw 2 cards feels pretty good. It's probably still not more than a C though. And our last mono-red Mystical Archive card, and the last card we're going to look at in this video, is Urza's Rage, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare instant. It has Kicker for 8 generic and a red. Can't be countered, and it deals 3 damage to any target. If it was kicked, it does 10 damage to that permanent or player, and the damage can't be prevented. This card's an old favorite of mine, so it's cool to see it in the Mystical Archive. 3 mana to do 3 to any target at instant speed is usually in the lower range of premium removal. Then this has crazy late game upside, where if you can kick it, it does 10 damage instead. Now, 90% of this time this will be doing 3, but because this is such a nice baseline already, having the kicker upside is awesome, especially in blue-red, which will have the ability to ramp. I think you'll first pick this in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Those are all the red cards that will appear in Strixhaven draft boosters. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about the green ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.